Well, hey there, this is Cindy, and welcome to the Art of Feminine Negotiation or Persuasion. And today we are going to be talking with Izzy Gesell about negotiating in the bedroom, how to negotiate better relationships with your intimate partner. So welcome, Izzy. So great to have you here.
Thank you. It's fun to be here. And I am curious about what's going to come up myself.
Yes, this is a no holds barred conversation. So brace yourself to our listeners out there. And some of you may have had the chance to catch Izzy already on an earlier episode where he shared gems about up-leveling your negotiation skills using improv. And as always, Izzy was just a fountain of valuable insights. And he does it with such a fresh perspective and humor and with compassion and grace. And when he talked about his work with couples around negotiating the bedroom, I knew I just had to get him back here to share with you. So for those of you who don't know him, Izzy helps individuals and organizations transform their thinking. He is one of the first to use improv theater concepts as tools for both personal and organizational learning and growth. And he's always a highly rated speaker at conferences. You'll see why very shortly. And he's trained, everything from NASA engineers in leadership to insurance customer reps to manage stress. He's guided Hewlett-Packard global managers to communicate more effectively. And today, as I say, we're going to hone in on relationships. So be prepared to get rid of any distractions here and concentrate, because I guarantee you will walk away with some interesting insights and tips. So for those of you who missed our last episode, Izzy, why don't you just sort of recap when and how you made that connection between improv and negotiation?
Most of my work is about the application of improv theater principles to regular life, be it business life, professional life, personal life. The skills that make improv people successful are really not only useful these days, but almost mandatory in this COVID-driven risk reassessment, uncertainty about the future. The past is gone, the future is unknown. We have the present to act, and we have to really take risks because we don't know the outcome. Yeah. And it occurred to me about 20 years ago, as I was doing improv and stand-up comedy, that improv was essentially a life skill, not the performance so much as the practice. Yeah. And that's where I began my work. And what I found was that these skills are applicable in so many areas. And looking at my own life and my own self-development, I began to, consciously or not, I don't remember, start putting them, these ideas, the yes and, the playfulness, the risk-taking, the role-playing, the consent, the boundaries. What I realized was that they were aspects of what I could use in my relationships, and to take it down to another level, to my intimate relationships. Yeah. In other words, improv is about vulnerability, about being able to make a statement, to follow other people's leads, to say what's on your mind, and then let go of the need to control the outcome. And somehow, and maybe that's one of the things that worked for me, I got to see that's what the core of some relationships are, that deep relationships, intimate relationships need that playfulness, that riskability, that vulnerability, that acceptance, that compassion. And that's what improv was. So when we were talking a few weeks ago after the last visit here, your business is about the boardroom to the bedroom. And I said, Cindy, what have you, this work that I do is relevant there, both in my own experience and the work that I've done with relationship organizations. And so that's why we're here.
Yeah, no, and I love it. And I remember the first time I ever heard you speak about this in Clubhouse, this idea, we were in a Clubhouse room on negotiation, and you brought some insights about improv and how those principles can apply. And it was just like a light went off for me. I'm like, my gosh, that is so relevant. And for those of you who wonder out there what the reference is to the boardroom to the bedroom, my tagline is, I believe all of life is a negotiation. So, and my tagline is always, the art of feminine negotiation, how to get what you want from the boardroom to the bedroom. And, as I say, Izzy, I believe all of life is a negotiation, but most people don't see their intimate relationships as a negotiation. So I would love your thoughts on that. And you've already sort of given so much there. Maybe unpack a little bit about that. To what extent are intimate relationships a negotiation? And then we can get into sort of some of those improv principles that help us out there.
The first thing is, one of the connections is between negotiation and intimacy is, do you know yourself? Do you know what you're coming in with? Do you know what your goals are? Do you know what you'd be satisfied with? Is your expectation of yourself and the outcome and the other person or people in this case realistic? Yeah. Or is it a dream? Or are you trying to control to a specific outcome? Or are you open to a process that along the way may change? And that last statement is a very strong connection to improv. Are you trying to control a story you can't control? Or are you going into a process where you yes and, even if you have a different opinion, do you accept the fact that your other person in the negotiation has a different opinion, and can you honor that and that person?
So nice. And for those who aren't familiar with improv, like I love the yes and concept. Can you tell a little bit about that for maybe people who aren't familiar with what that
Yeah,
is and how it shows
yeah.
up?
In my experience, yes and is the most common and widely accepted idea, if not always understood, that
Yep.
comes from improv. The common wisdom is you have to say yes to everything. And what gets lost is the differentiation between acceptance and agreement.
Mm,
So a yes and in improv is I accept what you're giving me. I accept your opinion in negotiations, and I'm going to add to that. And I could add my opinion, which is different.
okay.
Yes, you think that, and I think differently. Let's explore the difference is different than yes, you think that, but I think differently, and one of us is wrong.
Yeah, beautiful. Now you had mentioned in your sort of in the intro there about COVID, and I actually just thought I want to circle back to that. Like, what impact do you think COVID has had on relationships? I mean, you're here, the divorce rates and separation rates went through the roof. So I'd love some of your insights on the impact of COVID since you mentioned it.
Well, in a broad sense, COVID has forced each of us to really assess and maybe understand from a different perspective our comfort with risk.
Yeah.
I mean, now we're risking, we do our risk assessment when we go to the supermarket, when we walk down the street. During the heyday of the infections, even maybe before vaccines or after vaccines, I remember deciding whether to cross the street if someone was coming towards me. I think this idea of risk assessment and risk awareness has completely changed, and I think is one of the driving factors in the politicalization of COVID. The other is that people have been forced to spend time in areas that they're not used to being in with other people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so and to top that off or to bottom that out, the roles have become conflated. So your personal role, your business role, your relationship role, your parental role, your friendship role have all been conflated and different. So it's sort of like having a jigsaw puzzle where we have all the pieces, but we don't have the cover.
Oh, that's so good. What a great analogy. I love that.
So I said, well, how do these fit together?
Yeah.
Do I need more time? Where am I going to go? Can I put my laptop on the kitchen table, but I have to make dinner, and then this is coming up. Can I invite my friend? Are they vaccinated? Well, I don't know. Well, would you find out? I don't want to ask. All of a sudden, there's negotiation on just about everything that was almost unconsciously done before.
Yeah. And I want to circle back on this idea about risk that you've raised. It was again one of the, lights were going off for me there, because I think people don't think consciously very often about risk or the role of risk in relationships, and particularly our intimate relationships. But as you were speaking, I'm like, my gosh, it's all about risk and vulnerability. So I'd love if you could speak to that a bit, what the role of risk is in our intimate relationships, and what are some things we can do to better manage that or handle it.
The first is to be aware of it. I know, think back to when I was just starting to date, or even now, I guess it doesn't matter with the time, a risk of, should I call this person? Should I wait for them to call me? Should I ask them out? Should I ask them for coffee? Or all these questions where you're consciously or unconsciously understanding that you're taking a risk by going after what you think you want.
Yeah.
And that what you're not realizing, and where the improv mindset can help you, is that you're always in control of what you ask for. You're not always in control of the answer you get.
Yeah.
And then the question is, what do you judge? How do you judge the answer? Judging it from your character? Are you becoming a victim if they say no? Do you feel less attractive? All these questions. And then the other risk is, once you get into a relationship, and let's say we're going into the bedroom, more intimate, I have this idea that I'd like to try because I heard about it.
Yeah.
But the question, what am I risking by acknowledging to myself? Am I saying to myself, that's weird. Why do you even consider that? And then secondly, what is the other person going to say? And then the third is, what if they say yes? What do I do? And the fourth is, what if we're doing it? Are we doing it right? And how do we keep moving? So I'm not going to say anything.
Yeah, that's so good. And that vulnerability piece, it's funny because again, as you're speaking, about that dating, I think we all sort of recognize, oh, there's risk at the front end of that process when you're younger, or even if you're older and you're back on the dating scene or whatever. But I think we assume that once you're in a committed relationship, that risk is less. And that's not the case. You're facing those constant risks, as you say, whether it's new fantasies, or you and I were chatting before we got online, and we can circle back to it about aging. But I'm going to share a story here that I'm sure my husband is going to be mortified that I shared this, no doubt. But quite early in our relationship, I remember the very first time I ever, I got full on dressed up, right? Like the big thigh high boots, not a lot else, very, and I walked into the room, and my husband, he's that like small town country boy, right? In many ways. And his look, Izzy, was of such absolute shock, right? When I first walked in the room, because there was no warning. I just walked in. I didn't even give an opportunity. My own, like that vulnerability kicked in. I went into immediate shutdown mode because I didn't get the immediate response that I'd wanted. Turned and walked out of the room, took the outfit off. And again, it was a while, and we didn't even speak about it, which was ridiculous, right? I mean, this was many, we've been married 26 years now, so many years ago. But boy, that idea about that ongoing risk really resonated as you were speaking to me.
So you highlight the power of vulnerability, and the power it has to keep us from moving forward, and the power it has for retreating. So if you think about, again, in improv, the more you practice the roles, in improv, there are no real world consequences. So you can have a role as a sexual person meeting a person who is not sexual in a date, and how do you play that? And because there are no real world consequences for the game, you can experiment with that. And then maybe you could switch. I mean, improv is all about role playing and storytelling, and relationships and intimacy is very much about role playing and storytelling. So I love your story in that it highlights the fact that everybody comes into a negotiation with a preconceived history. In fact, I remember one of my improv teachers really encouraging me. Well, what happened would be in a scene, and you ask the audience or the other players, who are they? Well, there's two people, they're in the grocery store, and one of them has a screaming kid and the other one's behind the line. What goes on? And you play it. And what this teacher said to me, reminded me, was when you go in there, know where that person came from before they got into the grocery store. In other words, what are they bringing? Are they in a hurry? Do they have no money? Did they just have a fight with their friend? That factors into how you play the role. And what I heard in your story was that you came in with a story that was very different than your husband's story. And the stories sort of like went to this. And what I think was so powerful, A, your vulnerability in telling the story, and B, the recognition that when these things happen, we're so uncomfortable, we spread apart. We don't stay, look, let's take a breath in negotiation. Maybe look, let me go change, and let's come back in 5 minutes and let's see where we're at. Where's that? I wanted to feel a little more sensual. I was looking for a compliment. I was looking for you to say, oh, wow, that's great. I wanted to beat your fantasy. And you're saying, oh my goodness, what am I supposed to do now? I just
he was like, help, deer in the headlights, right?
That happens a lot, in that the part of intimacy that we haven't really touched on is the vulnerability, and the vulnerability forces us to retreat before we've built trust. So one of the things about improv and intimacy is you play the games, you build trust because you have empathy to the person, because things are so unknown.
Yeah. And speaking of unknowns, like, I don't know if you've ever heard of or done, I forget her name now, Jada, I think, something like that. And she has this erotic blueprint. And Dawn and I much later ended up doing it. And it explains a lot. Like, we all have these sort of erotic blueprints, whether you're sensual or sexual, or the shapeshifter is when you can shift between, like, that sensual, sexual, I forget what the other one, kinky. There were all different sort of categories of it. And depending on where, it's kind of like the love languages, depending on, which blueprint you fit into, communication is so important. And I'd love if you could speak to triggers for a moment, because again, Izzy, as you were sort of unpacking my story, one of the things that really hit me is we assume when we're in a committed relationship, we're in that safe space and we're going to be less triggered. But I think the opposite is true, because there's such vulnerability there, and the stakes are so much higher in those intimate relationships. Sometimes all of that baggage, the stories, as you say, that we brought to the table, can cause those triggers to be really high. And I know you do some great work on how to defuse triggers, certainly in the workplace. And that, any advice you'd have for couples on how to deal with some of those triggers?
Yeah, the biggest challenge to de-emphasizing the trigger or taking away their explosiveness is that we don't spend enough time talking about the triggers before they're triggered.
Yeah.
And this is another benefit of what the improv mindset can help you. You can talk about the comfort or discomfort you have with the role, with the status. Remember, intimacy, sexuality, relationships in general are very much about power exchange. Even the words on who's on top and who's on bottom and who's going to lead and who's going to follow is very much about a power exchange, and a good relationship, a good physical, spiritual, emotional, intellectual relationship is about equity and power exchange. It doesn't have to be equal, but so for example, if I have the comfort to say to you, let's try it where I'll do anything you want. You try, would you find a fantasy that works for you and I will follow you. So I'm equal, I'm equitable, but I'm letting you take the lead.
Yeah.
And the understanding, and improv is very good at showing how sometimes you're in control and sometimes you're not. And you get to, and you realize the emotion that comes up when you offer a word, for example, or an activity, and the person doesn't pick up on it and gives you something completely different. And you have to say, I wanted you to do something else, but I'm going to accept the fact that, yes, you did that, and I'm going to follow you, means we can move forward.
Yeah.
And that's another issue with the triggers, is that very often we get stuck at the trigger because the emotions rise. As emotions go up, logic goes down. With the improv approach, you put that judgment aside and say, okay, I'm curious. I'm going to submit to that and follow it a little bit.
Oh, so beautiful. And you've already given some great gems about how improv can help intimacy between couples or the intimate relationship. We've talked about vulnerability and risk and trust building and control already. Any other aspects of and role play? I mean, I love the crossover. It is amazing to me how improv, as you say, is such a broad-based life skill that can affect everything. So what are some other improv principles you can think of that show up or could be used in intimacy between couples?
Boundaries are key, boundaries and consent.
Yeah.
So one of the things I've learned in relationships, again, in general, but certainly in intimate parts, is you talk about the boundaries beforehand. So if I come up with an idea, fantasy, there's a lot of sexuality on TV now in movies. And you say, well, I saw this on TV and I don't know, spanking. Let's try that. Well, what does that mean for you? I don't like to be hit, and don't touch my shoulder because I'm sore. There's boundaries, and we have a safe word.
Yeah.
So if I say red, just stop. Don't ask me why. Don't just stop. So that's negotiation. Negotiation of boundaries and consent. Consent goes towards what you're allowed to do. Boundaries are where you have to stop. And that's an improv thing too. So a game called One Word at a Time, which we played before. The consent is each of us will do a word. And the boundaries are we won't do more than one. But if somebody does, we can have flexible boundaries.
Yeah. So good. And as you were saying there, it reminded me too that the idea about no judgment, when you said, don't ask me why, right? If my word is red, then we just stop and don't ask, because I think there's that fear of judgment that comes up all the time as well. That can be a block for being able to have that.
And we have to recognize that. So again, in the improv concept, you'll see where your judgment comes up, and the training is to put it aside. It's not to never do it. It's to observe it and understand what the context is, and then be able to say to yourself, I'm judging and I have trust in this person. I've agreed to this. I'll try it a little bit further. Remember, you always have the control to stop. In improv, it's always, you can say the end. Scene is over.
Oh, that's good.
Over to you.
And all joking aside, I could see how that would be a great skill, that if somebody's in a place where they're hitting discomfort, I mean, as much as we're laughing, that being able to say the end, right? There's tremendous.
That's in improv, the end is the safe word.
That's so great. I hadn't thought of that before.
Now,
you had mentioned the one word exercise that we did last time, and I know you have some great exercises that you use. Can you happen to think of any exercises that you could share that would maybe help couples who feel that they're losing their intimacy or connection in the relationship?
Yeah, let's do one called Fortunately, Unfortunately. The idea is one person starts, in this case, I'll start, and I'm going to make a statement, something about the topic. And what I'd like you to do is continue the conversation, but start with the word unfortunately, and then make up the story for a few sentences. Then when it's my turn, I'll go fortunately to turn it around. Then you go unfortunately. So we're going to create a story where we go back and forth with fortunately, unfortunately.
I love you. Always put me on the spot. I should have known better than to ask for an exercise. Darn it.
Well, you asked for it. So, So Cindy, so here's the intimacy connection. When we're in an intimate connection where one of us has said, let's try this. I know it's a little bit risky.
Yeah.
And then the discomfort or the embarrassment or the uncertainty comes up, then we could say to the person, you did this, I'm willing to go along.
Yeah.
Let's try it. What I admire about what you just did and and I think is the skill is admit your discomfort and vulnerability.
Yeah.
So often in intimate moments when we're not comfortable being touched or something is going on, we feel it's impossible for us to say, I want you to know that I'm not comfortable. I'm not saying you should stop but I'm saying I'm uncomfortable. I'm nervous.
Yeah.
And then it's my job or my desire to accept the yes, you're nervous and you mentioned it and I'm willing to go along. So let's try it a little bit.
Yeah.
So what I'm doing, that's the safe space, is for you to be less than perfect and for you to be uncomfortable and me not to run away.
Yeah, so powerful on so many levels, right? I love this stuff. So beautiful. All right.
So remember, you're going to do unfortunately and continue the story. Hey, Cindy, I saw this movie that showed what it's like, for these new virtual sex toys. I think I'm going to investigate virtual sex toys.
Yeah, unfortunately, this whole virtual world causes such a disconnect between people. I'm worried that it really is going to cause such a big loss of intimacy.
Fortunately, that awareness could bring a conversation to people that can help them overcome the disconnect and start to talk to each other on a heart-based level.
Yes, and unfortunately, that there needs to be a level of comfort, though, to have those conversations. There's an expectation that people will have these open, vulnerable conversations, but not everybody's comfortable doing that.
Fortunately, there's a website that lists a lot of stories from people who have had this problem, and there's groups that we could join and maybe have conversations with other people.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff on the internet these days that looks trustworthy on its face, but I've heard horror stories about what could happen if you end up with an unreliable source that you rely on.
Let's pause here and
good.
go there. Yeah, you can also switch it around and start with fortunately, and it's a little bit different. You can do it with 2 or 3 or 4 people. Like you can do all kinds of intimate things with 2 and 3 and 4 people. But so the idea there is what it does is, first of all, it's playful. Secondly, you can actually have a conversation where, let's say we're negotiating about the boundaries and consent, where someone said, unfortunately, I'm not comfortable being touched. And the other person, fortunately, I don't have to use my hands. I can use a feather. Unfortunately, I'm allergic to feathers. Well, fortunately, I could find wet spaghetti, and that's fine. So the key, like in negotiation, the key is to keep the conversation going, and until you can reach a place where, okay, let's move on.
Well, and the thing I recognized as we were doing it, what a beautiful way to be able to address both the positive and negative, and to be able to have people work through their fears. Because as you're expressing that, you're allowing the space for that, unfortunately, and being able to respond to the counterpoint. So both people feel heard and a way to work through it. I think it's such a valuable tool. I love that.
It's problem solving, and it also is a way to indicate, because what happens in intimate moments, again, people come in with expectations and stories and their whatever baggage they have. And it's so loaded because the sexual histories, the sensual histories, the intimate histories are carrying so much baggage, if you will, that in this case, we don't need to be stopped by it. We can start expecting things to be open to unexpected outcomes.
Yeah. And you just hit on something so important there, and that's that sexual tension heightens things, right? I mean, there's so much there's anxiety and taboos for a lot of people around it. So, I mean, this is always important in negotiation, but particularly in the intimate relationships, I totally see, Izzy, what you're saying, how everything gets heightened because those stories that we bring to bear have all kinds of emotional baggage depending on our experiences and upbringing, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And
now, do you find gender differences play a role?
In some cases they do, because the gender experiences are different. And so, for example, generally men, and because gender roles are fluid these days, and I'm really talking generally or stereotypically, men have not been sexualized as much as females. Yeah. So men don't grow up aware of how they're being stared at, or they're being sexualized, or they're being, fantasized about. And females have much more constant from what I understand, experiences of that kind. So sex or intimacy can mean different things to different people,
Yeah.
along gender lines and certainly along other lines also. So the question then becomes, how can you bring that out and bring it as part of the negotiation table? Understanding about where the person is from. In
Yeah.
negotiation, as you teach, knowing where the person's coming from is as important as knowing where they want to go.
Yeah.
So example of, I'm a cancer survivor, and I've done some work with prostate cancer survivors, not only the men who have had the illness, but their relationships, their caregivers. One of the big challenges in this area is about erectile dysfunction, about performance. And one of the gender differences I found, or the role difference, is that men are very loath and unable in some ways to talk about it and take some responsibility. And women are over concerned about their responsibility and their ability to fix it. Men won't take responsibility. Women tend to take too much responsibility.
Oh, I could totally see that. That's
Yeah.
one of the things I do with women on purpose, a lot of work around that women,
Yeah.
that conditioning to be the nurturers and the caregivers and to martyrs and take on everything. And that must get really complicated. I know we were talking briefly about this before. Must get complicated if you've got the male not taking responsibility and the woman assuming, oh, he doesn't find me attractive anymore, this is my fault, taking all the baggage around that. And then you layer on that as we get older as women, our bodies change as well, whether we're not lubricating as well, and nobody wants to talk about this stuff. And what's been your experience? I think a lot of people probably end up just giving up, right? And not working at the intimacy anymore because the conversation seems too daunting.
Yeah. And it's not just the women and their bodies, it's men also. Erectile, I mean, men have the little blue pills, the Viagra.
Yeah.
So again, and I think that that's very symbolic of the way the world treats the difference in intimacy between men and women. It's men have a way to be fulfilled, and women continue to be the receptacles.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's powerful.
Literally. And if you think about it, going back to what's the driver, men as boys, we're not taught very much about our sex drive or our puberty or our responsibility as males in a society where we are the power in many ways, consciously around. It's the same way with institutional racism. People say, well, everything's equal. No, it's not. It's never been equal. And the result of never being equal is what we're living with today. And the same is true in the relationships. So women very often are feeling, well, I'm not attractive enough, or rather than saying, go get yourself fixed and come back. I'm doing fine. I got my little rabbit. I don't have to spend $45 to get a pill.
That's so good. And I love that you're speaking about this stuff so openly, because I think awareness is like anything. It's that first big hurdle, right? To be addressing these.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's one more thing that comes to mind is that what happens as we get older, or we lose for so often for many men, it really is about erection dependent sex.
Yeah.
Oh, you got to get a direct. Moving beyond erection dependent sex is really important. And I think that's, as we get older, we're forced to, because we have physical limitations. And this is where I think the fantasy world can come in, the intimacy world can come in with toys, with sensations. Remember, sensual is about sensations.
Yes.
Use your other sensations. There's visual, there's auditory. So I think that role playing and using different sensations that are not intercourse focused is a very powerful way of freeing up the intimacy moments among people.
That's so true. And it's interesting because when we most need it, especially as we get older, I think for many couples, they're less likely to invest the time and energy to do that when it would probably serve the best value.
There's still the shadow of the history of our discomfort with our sexuality. And our desire to explore, and our desire to be open to the reality of the situation. For many women, it's about body image, and the connection of, and I know as a male, I have been certainly in my past guilty of objectifying and recognizing the attraction of certain types. People talk about, you have a certain type.
Yeah.
Well, as you get old, if you want to expand your possibilities, then you expand your types.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny you
And
say that. It was always a joke in our relationship as well, because everybody, my husband's type, I am 180 degrees the opposite of what his typical type would have been, and the same. Like he's
right.
I would have walked into a bar and any of my friends would have been able to pick the person in the room who would have been my type, and it wasn't Dawn, and yet somehow it was that time and that
And
space.
that came up in a conversation I had with a bunch of folks, and with some men, and what I remember coming up, I don't remember who started this, but it certainly made sense to me, that very often we are in relationship, I'm talking about men and maybe women also, against our type, because we're taught to separate sexuality and sensuality from domesticity.
Interesting.
So we have the type that is very sexual,
Yeah.
but for many men, in my experience, there's the separation between the person you want to live with and be in your family, and the person you want to have sex with. And maybe that's something that is to look at, is what is it about this relationship that allows you to explore the areas you can't do, even if the person may not be your type.
Yeah. Oh, I
Because
love
your
that.
type is a fantasy as much as anything else.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and getting past that whole Madonna whore thing that you were just sort of alluding to, right? That
Yeah.
the two are separate and never the two shall meet, right?
Right. And there's also the same from the women's side, where I want to be the domestic mom, family woman during the day, and I want to be the party girl at night. So
Yeah.
it works both ways. So maybe that type, that working against type, is a way to bring those two things together. But very often we drop the sensuality part when we're different with our
Yeah.
type. So, well, I'm going to give up this lust in order for domesticity,
Yeah.
and you can have the lust too.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you add layer motherhood onto that, where again, there's so much baggage that comes layered on that, where people can lose intimacy if they're not really intentional and do some of the things that you're talking about here, Izzy. So I just love that. Now, what role does emotion play in these intimate negotiations in your experience?
Quite a bit. And one of the keys is to recognize the aware emotions, the observed emotions, and the shadow emotions. So I think whatever personal development people have done, it's important to recognize that we all have had journeys, more extremity or less extremity, that brings us to the place. And the other piece is, and I know this from my own work, but also work with others, sometimes the emotions come up that they don't really need, you can put them aside. So example, fantasies.
Yeah.
I've talked with a lot of folks at various times who are discomforting with their own fantasies, because, well, what does this say about me? Or and there's something true with comedians also. Right now, there's this argument or discussion about some things are not supposed to be talked about by comedians. And the one comedian was saying, look, I talk about these things, I don't do these things. So can I write about these things even if I don't do these things, because they're. And I think there's a parallel in the intimacy, is that some compassion, it may not matter where your fantasy comes from, as long as in context of society, yourself, other people, it either states. Many fantasies should never be played out. They live their lives as fantasies.
Yeah.
Like stories, they live their lives as stories.
Yeah.
So you can have fantasies and live your life that way, and keep it as a fantasy. You don't have to do it. That's another thing that comes up very often. If I think it, that means I have to do it. That means I'm this kind of person. That means, oh my goodness, I can't do that. I'm going to shut it off.
Yeah. And another layer to that, actually, as you're saying that, Izzy, is being able to talk about, you can talk about really dark fantasies and have an intimate moment, sort of sharing that and playing out without actually having to necessarily even follow through on it. I think there can be some great.
Exactly. In the same way that we have fantasies about who we want to be when we grow up, or, or where we want to travel. We have bucket lists.
Yeah.
Those are all to do. But you can have intimacy bucket lists that some of them you'll try and some of them not.
Nice.
Let's develop a level of confidence and trust in each other, where we can talk about, I'll generically call it the shadow side, without shame or blame.
Yeah.
And see where we overlap. You want to do that? I'd like to do that too. Maybe we could watch a video, or maybe we go online. Let's do this together. And the focus then becomes away from us towards the outward thing together.
Yeah.
And that builds trust. When I share my uncomfortable revelations to you about me, and you share yours with me, we have a trust. And that's where this all comes from.
Yeah, and trust is the core of intimacy, right? Being able to, because it talks
Yes,
about
and
what you said, that trust allows that vulnerability, allows that intimacy, allows that experimentation.
yeah, and to go back to negotiation, I don't like the word compromise as much as blending things together.
Nice.
That, okay, you have this point of view, I have that point of view. How are we going to achieve a Venn diagram?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
I love that distinction, Izzy, that because compromise is a loaded word. People see compromise as giving up something that they want. I like that blending is a
a
much stronger.
blended solution
Yeah.
takes ingredients from both sides, and people call it win-win. Not crazy about that either, but I know what it means, and I think part of it, maybe this is for another conversation, is that you have to remember that not all of the fantasies or not all of the intimacy desires are going to be compatible.
Yeah. And recognizing that and finding a way to deal with that in a healthy way, where,
Finding
as you said,
right,
no judgment and no
yeah.
shame and blame or guilt around it. I
Just
love
like in relationships, you can't always get what you want.
that. Yes. Yeah. So beautiful.
You know,
Well,
you have to have some responsibility for the relationship part of it.
yeah. Well, is it, as usual, I can't believe how quick our time is going.
Mm.
I'm just going to have you as a regular to come back and
I'm
offer.
here. I love our conversations. You take me to places where I just love exploring
That's
these things. I've
such
learned so much from
powerful.
you. Yeah.
Such powerful shares. So thank you. And I'd love, I know last time you'd shared, I normally end by saying, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life? I know, given your openness to improv and living that lifestyle, you have all kinds of mindset shifts. So what's another mindset shift that you could share with our listeners here today?
I don't remember what the last one was, but the one that I was connected to right now, I mentioned yesterday to someone, what I learned from improv and is very relevant to intimacy is anything is possible, not everything will work.
Oh, that's so good. So good. That's a beautiful little nugget right there.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again, Izzy. It has been
Oh, you're
amazing
welcome.
having you here.
I
And
loved
for
it.
listeners, you make sure to check out Izzy as well. You can check out his website at izzyg.com. And what's your LinkedIn? Is it Izzy Gesell
It's
or
Izzy
what?
Gesell, Izzygessell. I have a couple of LinkedIn learning courses, one of which is on improv and one is on humor. So that would be a good aspect to bring to your intimacy relationships also.
Beautiful. And definitely, I really encourage you all to check out Izzy on LinkedIn. He posts regularly, and his posts are always really insightful and layered, right? They apply. You can take any one of his posts, in my experience, and apply it and go deeper and deeper into get benefit in all the areas of your life. So I am sure you've all just got loads of value from this episode. I certainly have loved the discussion. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done that already. And make sure to share this episode with anybody that you think could value from it. And let's face it, we humans, we crave and need that intimate connection. So definitely this is one of those episodes I encourage you to share. So glad you joined us today. And before we close off, just wanted to share some ways that we can work together if you're looking to elevate your negotiation skills. If you're looking for personalized input, then my signature one-on-one or mastermind or VIP experience might be for you. But I've also got online or group programs available to help you better leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life, from the boardroom to the bedroom, as we've just talked about here today. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, I invite you to go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve. Take care until next time.